Hi, everybody. This is Lisa Bloom. I'm the author of the new bestseller, Suspicion Nation, the inside story of the Trayvon Martin injustice and why we continue to repeat it. And you're listening to the Talk with Taj show.
The Stand Your Ground law has allowed another individual to gun down a young man because his music was too loud. They found him, I believe, for attempted murder of his friends, but acquitted him on his murder. You know, it has the Stand Your Ground law just given Americans, well, let me rephrase that. How can African Americans in particular protect themselves with this Stand Your Ground law that is moving rapidly throughout the U.S. as more states are allowing this new law to be implemented?
Taj, you're right. About half the states in the U.S. have Stand Your Ground laws, including my home state of California. You're talking about the Michael Dunn case, and he shot into the car with 4 African-American teenagers, and he shot and killed Jordan Davis, 17 years old, like Trayvon Martin, also unarmed, like Trayvon Martin. The jury was not able to reach a verdict on the top charge of murder against Jordan Davis, and so the jury hung on that charge, and there's going to be a retrial in May. So it's not over. But it was definitely an injustice, and Stand Your Ground was a big part of that case, because prior to Stand Your Ground being enacted in 2005, Michael Dunn, when he got into his car to get the gun, he would have been required to drive away, because prior to Stand Your Ground, the law was that we all have a duty to retreat if we can retreat safely from the violent situation without committing an act of violence ourselves. The law required de-escalation and nonviolence where that was possible. And I think that just comports with our common sense, that it's always better to get out of the situation without committing an act of violence if we can. But Stand Your Ground changes that, and Stand Your Ground says that you no longer have the duty to retreat. You can stand your ground, you can pull out a gun and fight. Nevertheless, you are still required to be in reasonable fear of imminent great bodily injury or death. And I think the prosecution failed to argue those important elements in the Zimmerman case, as I explain in my book, and also in the Michael Dunn case. And that's a big problem for them. They're not arguing the law effectively for self-defense. But listen, there's a reason why prosecutors and police don't like Stand Your Ground laws. And that's because it makes it harder for them to get convictions against people who are shooting each other on our streets.
Now, we know in law there are loopholes in a lot of situations. Mm-hmm. And the way the law is worded, there's always somebody willing to try to find a hole in there to try to get an acquittal or use that to their advantage and when they're being tried. With Stand Your Ground law, have you seen in these two situations, and as more situations have, the more cases have been coming up, where there are loopholes in Stand Your Ground law, and what do you think needs to be done to give people more of a defined definition of what Stand Your Ground law is, so when somebody does commit an act that we know that it's an illegal act, they don't have a loophole to stand behind?
Well, you know, Stand Your Ground itself can be considered a huge loophole in the law. I mean, it's extraordinary if you consider the fact that Stand Your Ground is a defense to killing another human being. And protecting human life should be the paramount concern of the law. That should be our highest priority. We shouldn't be coming up with excuses for people who shoot and kill other people. You know, in any case, when someone shoots another and they're caught, you know, they're going to have to come up with something. They're not going to be able to say, well, I shot him because I was angry. So self-defense is the most likely explanation that most people are going to give. When the other person is dead and can't defend themselves, you know, it can be very hard for the state attorneys to show that it wasn't self-defense. So, of course, people are always, and that's an age-old story that people are going to say, oh, he pointed a gun at me, he threatened to kill me. I mean, people know that that's what they should say. And George Zimmerman particularly knew that's what he had to say because he had just gotten an A in his criminal defense class, his criminal justice class. So, I mean, I see the entire law as a huge loophole, and I think it's better to return to the law where people have an obligation to retreat safely if they could rather than commit acts of violence.
How did the Trayvon Martin case affect you personally and professionally?
That's, you're the only person to ask me that, and I've done a lot of interviews, and I was very deeply disturbed by the case. I just found the whole way that it was handled offensive, and in particular offensive to African Americans. I'm white, by the way, but I just felt that this case was so mishandled from the point of view of race. The reason why millions of people demonstrated to get George Zimmerman arrested and then demonstrated after the acquittal peacefully is because of the obvious racial implications of the case. This is an old, sad American story of an unarmed African-American male who's killed by a white person, and the white person escapes justice. And I track a lot of that history in my book, Suspicion Nation, because it is a very disturbing part of our history, from slave days, from Jim Crow, up to the present. And, we all would like to be past that by now, but the sad reality is that we're not. This case, to me, was reminiscent of Emmett Till, another teenage African-American boy who was murdered by a southern white man. Emmett Till, like Trayvon Martin, had gone to a convenience store and bought some candy. His killer, like George Zimmerman, raised substantial legal defense funds from donations and was quickly acquitted in Emmett Till's case by an all-white jury, in George Zimmerman's case by a jury that was 5 out of 6 white jurors. I mean, I just felt this case was so disturbing. And afterwards, people who supported Zimmerman would say, well, it's over, the system played out, get over it. Right. And I would have lunch with my friends, several of whom are mothers of African-American boys. And they were so deeply sickened and disturbed and definitely not over it. And I found the very phrase, get over it offensive, or move on, and I couldn't get over it because it was not a fair trial. If it had been a fair trial and he had really not been guilty, that would have been one thing. I talk in the book about how initially I thought he probably wasn't guilty. When I first reviewed the evidence in the case, I thought, wow, this really looks like a self-defense case. I was prepared to go there, and that was basically how I was calling it on the air the first week. But then when I reviewed the evidence more carefully, what I was really disturbed at finding was that the evidence went in one direction and the prosecution went in another direction. So, this case fell like a bomb into my life. I was working on other projects. I ended up covering the case extensively for NBC. I thought I was done when it was over. I came back to my home in LA, and after a couple of weeks, I really could not be done with it, and I had to find out these additional information. I had to get the answers, and then I just 24/7 worked on this book because I want everybody who has that gut feeling that something was wrong in this case to know that they're right, and to have a response to all of those who say, get over it.